Alberta is a beautiful province of abundant wind and solar potential that's been kneecapped by anti-competition legislation led by our pro-oil and anti-free market Premier Danielle Smith. In this video, we're going to go over how Danielle Smith's command economy policies are hurting Albertans and why a mix of renewable energy and nuclear power could support an energy-independent Alberta. But first, I gotta ask, what does a conservative government make you think of in North America? For me and many others, it's about support of free markets and businesses, while also maintaining traditional values. Whether that's true in practice or not, conservative politicians generally pay lip service to these ideas. Alberta, which is often called Canada's Texas, has lower regulations, strong industrial capacity, cowboys, and lots of oil. Those lower regulations in Texas have led to an explosion of renewable energy installations in the state. Alberta was on the same trajectory with over 90% of new renewable investments in the province until the UCP and Danielle Smith won in 2023. After which she decided that the government knows better than private enterprise and put a moratorium on renewable energy development in the province. Her policies directly resulted in a 23% reduction of land that renewables could be built on, while over $11 billion in investment has been affected, with at least 33 projects being cancelled because of her. What is this policy, you might ask? Well, there's three main points. First, they put a 35-kilometer buffer near areas of what they call pristine beauty. Second, they disallowed renewables on high-value farmland unless cogeneration existence can be confirmed. And three, they added the creation of a fund for renewable decommissioning. At face value, I don't even disagree with these, and they're not unreasonable requests. However, the problem is that this policy disproportionately affects renewable energies and not other sources. What do you think affects pristine beauty more? Wind turbines or coal mines? What about logging clear cuts or gas wells? I'm not even against these kind of projects, but it's clearly favoritism to only apply these rules to renewables and not to other industries. As for farmland, there's a huge body of research showing that cogeneration can be beneficial to farmland, especially in drought conditions, by providing shade or simply by providing farmers more income they can spend on increasing their total output. A fund for renewable decommissioning is reasonable, but let's be honest, oil and gas production is a far greater environmental hazard. Additionally, it's valuable to clean up renewables because of the valuable minerals they are built with, while capping old oil wells is simply a negative externality of oil and gas. Hence why there's over 100,000 wells in the province that are yet to be dealt with. The issue at hand is that Smith doesn't actually understand how renewables work either.
Fuel source that only works 10% of the time in the case of sun in our market, or 30% of the time in the case of wind, is not something that you can power an industrialized economy on.
Here, she states that they only operate 10% of the time for solar or 30% of the time for wind. That's just simply untrue. Now, Smith is a bit of an idiot, and she seems to be mixing up capacity factor with availability. Capacity factor is the amount that the energy source produces versus its installed capacity. So if I build a 100 megawatt wind farm with a capacity factor of 30%, then I would only get on average 30 megawatts, sometimes more, sometimes less, but this is included in the economic trade-offs. So when she says that wind only blows 30% of the time, she's lying. Availability would be how often the wind is blowing and producing power, how often it's producing at 30%. If we look at Alberta's publicly available renewable energy data set for the last 2 years, we can see that the availability of wind was 80% of the time using a capacity factor greater than 10%, which is standard for the literature on this subject, while solar power was only 42% of the time, which makes sense with day and night cycles. But combined solar and wind was available 80 to 90% of the time.
You have to have a wind and a solar grid plus a fossil fuel grid. Well, how in the world could anyone with any sense whatsoever think that that constituted an improvement?
But of course, Jordan Peterson is nodding along while she's saying all these things because he doesn't understand this topic at all. Later in the discussion, they talk about nuclear energy, or lack thereof. She also states that she thinks large interconnected grids are a plausible lie and that the left only comes up with solutions that make things worse. That's rich coming from a woman who's actively blocking the free market and private investors who are choosing to invest in our province. And she implemented her policy in spite of the Alberta Electric System Operator officials disagreeing with her decision. So do we really think Smith knows better than energy experts and the private companies wanting to invest in our province? Obviously, I'm being a little bit coy here. She's not logically making these policies. But Smith, if you really don't want an interconnected grid, fine, I've done the math for you. If we take Alberta's energy data between 2023 and 2024, we can determine what proportion of solar, wind, batteries, and nuclear power will be required to manage Alberta's grid. For this, I'm assuming no interconnectivity through power lines with other provinces or states. This would be Alberta going alone, the way Smith seems to like it. But that provides us with an interesting question. What do you think drives costs when we approach near 100% renewable energy? The answer is energy droughts. Times of low wind and low solar for extended periods of time with insufficient battery storage. There's lots of literature on this topic, and within the 2 years we're looking at, the worst drought for both systems was around 70 hours long. or around 3 to 4 days in January 2023. However, in other literature, I've seen as long as 10-day energy droughts for an area as large as Alberta, which is certainly something we want to hedge our bets against. It makes the value of nuclear go up even higher. So to figure out how big our energy system needs to be, all we need to do is look at the length of storage plus the amount of baseload power we would need during that drought. If you look at this chart, we can see that the energy demand during this 2023 period was about 10,500 megawatts, and the capacity factors for wind and solar are extremely low after the 14th of January and don't recover until the 18th of January. The math is pretty simple, and I've detailed this kind of mathematics in other videos if you're interested, but you just run an economic optimizer that tries to minimize operating costs and capital costs over the time frame. Overall, our renewable systems would be about 60 to 70% of the energy system, while nuclear would be about 30 to 40% of energy demands, depending on battery storages between 3 and 24 hours. However, if you take an optimistic 2035 nuclear case and go for 100% nuclear power, it could actually provide the lowest capital costs and user costs at $60 billion USD and $102 per megawatt hour, assuming nuclear comes down to the cost that we think in 2035, about $5,000 per kilowatt. However, with that said, we can also do an optimistic case for renewable and batteries, which would yield similar results at about $78 billion USD and an average power cost of $94 per megawatt hour with 3 hours of storage, while having nuclear as a backup option for low renewable cases, meaning its charge out rate is actually $360 per megawatt hour, but it only operates 15% of the time. We can quibble on the details, but overall, Alberta should target at least a 60% renewable energy mix and upwards of 40% nuclear. And I know I've argued against nuclear in the past, but I really don't care about what technology we use as long as we're decarbonizing in the most economic way possible. And if that means more nuclear power, then sweet. But this isn't what Smith is doing. She's hamstringing renewable energy and paying lip service to nuclear, which she knows will take at best until 2035 to bring to the province. So between now and 2035, at the very least, we should be targeting much higher renewable energy installations. Because even though they will need natural gas backups for most cases, like in the January 2023 case, the overall reduction in emissions would be huge. Right now, around 65% of our power is non-renewable. The optimistic case I described would have nuclear replaced with natural gas, only operating 15% of the time, dramatically reducing our carbon footprint. And then, once nuclear can get online, it can replace the natural gas. Additionally, I'd like to see us implement what's called a capacity remuneration mechanism, a system similar to that which is used in Texas. It promotes firm power systems like nuclear, natural gas, or batteries, and price the grid stability they add into the market. This way, the market can accurately price in the economics of different energy systems into our power system. I have another video here that you can look at, or you can pause the definition on the screen. At the end of the day, natural gas and oil prices are volatile. It can drive a lot of inflation. Would it not be better to be energy independent of such a resource? Then we as a province would be free to sell even more oil and gas to the market as needed, and by not having to rely on it domestically, we can reap all of the profits. I'm not under any illusions that will just stop oil, but why be at its mercy? Solar, wind, batteries, and nuclear benefit from having low operating costs, meaning that once they're installed, they just pay dividends in the long run. Whereas carbon-based energy systems rely on drilling costs, global supply chains, and many other factors out of Alberta's control. If we want a strong and diversified industry in the province, then cheap power is what we need. The reality is that means less fossil fuels. We can make that change now or be forced down the road. Low-cost power is the bedrock for industrial capacity, and unfortunately Smith would rather we artificially pay more for energy. These videos have put me in a weird position, where I feel like I have to explain basic economic principles to people who claim to be conservative. Obviously, that's not all conservatives. There's plenty of conservatives who agree with sound economic policies like carbon taxes or renewable energy, but it's unsettling to see how many people who are conservatives throw away their principles to own the libs who like renewables, so therefore they have to be against it, rather than address policies on a case-by-case basis. Now we could play the philosophy game and state that most people don't derive their beliefs from first principles and rather conform to the groups they associate with, or cling to whatever confirms their pre-existing beliefs. If you don't believe me, just ask a Trump supporter how they think tariffs work. I'm picking on conservatives a bit here, because the UCP is in power in Alberta, but this happens on both sides. Regardless, we need to be able to push past that and realize Smith's government is pushing anti-science, anti-capitalist policies that will hurt Albertans financially. You can't call the left socialists and then in the same breath restrict the free market. And that's what we've seen from Smith, from restricting personal freedoms to picking winners and losers in the energy economy. I don't know about you, but to me that's much more communist than it is capitalist. What's that saying again? Don't assign malice for that which can be explained by stupidity.